Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Welcome to a really special event that we have today. I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Saphire Ruiz. They are a senior, a Posse Boston scholar, an organizer, and aspiring educator. And they have spent the last 4 years at Hamilton deeply involved in student movements and organizations, primarily the Black and Latinx Student Union, the Feminist of Color Collective, and as president of the Hamilton student body. They are particularly focused on the emotional work and affective labor of women and gender-variant students of color and how race, gender, and class impact educational inequity and studying the anti-capitalist student-centered education reform movements as a way out of this mess. For the last 8 months, they've been conducting research under the Senior Fellowship Program at Hamilton. Their research, titled The Settler, Colonial and Plantation Politics of Hamilton College, is focused on tracking, historicizing, and analyzing activist movements at Hamilton College. Through detailed interviews with alumni, current and former staff and faculty, as well as deep archival research and discourse analysis, Saphire has focused on 3 activist histories at Hamilton. Specifically, number 1, the South African divestment movements in the 80s. The second, the Social Justice Initiative from 2007 to 2010. And more recently, the movement, which dates from 2013 to 2015. Through their research, they deconstruct cycles of student rebellion and the ways that Hamilton College was created, is sustained by, and intentionally reproduces white supremacist patriarchal capitalism. They interrogate concepts of diversity and inclusion, analyze the significance of solidarity and conflict resolution in rebellions, and highlight the tactics used by the college to undermine student protest and dissent. I am so pleased to have worked with them this year and really excited to hear the talk. So let's please give them a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Before we fully get started, I think we're having some echo feedback. Is your laptop muted itself?
I think it's coming out of the speaker here, so we need to adjust.
You'd think by now we'd have this figured out, but Zoom is always a whole thing.
Okay, let's see where we're at now.
Yeah, it sounds like that worked, because I can't hear it anymore either. Can someone in the chat let us know if that worked? Okay, thank you. Thanks.
I'm going to do one more thing.
Okay.
Sorry. That should solve the problem entirely.
All right, beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming in. And thank you, Professor Rani, for that wonderful introduction. If you didn't notice, this is my little dedication page. And just want to make sure. Okay, cool. And this is something that I will be showing again at the end. But yeah, this is basically just what I've dedicated my research to. So as Professor Durrani mentioned, my research is titled The Settler, Colonial and Plantation Politics of Hamilton College. This is what I've been working on for the last 8 months, which is a very long time. It's been the only thing that I've been working on. If you're in my circles, you know that I literally just stay in my room and do work all day. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about some purpose and methods, some frameworks and terminology that I'm using, a brief literature review, and some history of Hamilton. And then, of course, we'll get into the meat of it, which is the history of rebellion and Hamilton's dedication to white supremacy. And then we'll talk a little bit about recent history and the abolition of higher education. I do want to note that my paper is 140 pages long, and so obviously I could not put all of this into the presentation, so there's a lot that's missing. So if you are interested in learning more about all the things that I went through and having all of my analyses, because there was just no way I could put them all up in here, I do have a sign up here. Where at the end you can sign up, and I can make sure to send that over to you in 2 days when it's officially done. Content warning, obviously, because we're going to be talking about a lot of really heavy stuff. There's a lot of anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, racism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. So if something particularly hits you and you want to leave the room, please feel free to leave the room. I understand it's a very heavy topic. So I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of why I decided to do this and what my motivations were. So as many of you know, I am an organizer, an aspiring educator. I've spent a large part of my life organizing, especially in the last 3 years. And when I came into Hamilton, I knew that I really wanted to expand on that work that I had started in high school. And I was under the impression that that would be really easy to do at Hamilton, except by the end of my first semester, I was very disillusioned and realized that that is not at all the case. And that there was really nothing happening on campus, and I didn't know what to do about that, and I was considering transferring and all these different things. And throughout my time organizing in the last 3 years, what I've come to discover is there's actually a very long history of activism and organizing at Hamilton, especially through organizations like the Black and Latinx Student Union, the Feminists of Color Collective, also the Center for Intersectional Feminism, and some other organizations. And I wanted to learn more about what exactly that history looked like, how did the institution respond to these things, and why are we now in a situation where there really isn't any strong organizing or activism happening, and when it does start to happen, why does it very suddenly disappear, and how historically has the institution responded to organizing and activism? Some methodology, I used primarily ethnography and discourse content or discourse/content analysis. I interviewed 57 past/current Hamilton members over the course of 8 months. That included 18 faculty members, both current and former, 1 former senior staff member, and 38 alumni across the 3 rebellions that I'll be looking at. And the primary reason why I decided to do ethnography was because I wanted to learn more about the personal and communal histories of the folks who were involved in these different movements, because that history really isn't recorded anywhere. And then I also had to do a lot of archival work. Thank you to the archives and Jeremy in the archives. Primarily, I looked at the Spectator because that is where a lot of the archives exists. And this was the primary way that I was able to understand some of the college's stances, because there really aren't public records of those stances. Some frameworks. So again, I have a lot more frameworks that I'm using than the few that I'll be looking at today, but for time's sakes, I couldn't include all of it and talk about all of it. But one of the main frameworks that I base my work off of is Bell Hook's term, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, which is her term used to describe the particular intersectional oppressive system that society operates within. And when I'm saying white supremacy, I'm referring specifically to Sharon Stewart's definition of it, which is the system of practices, policies, and behaviors that reinforce oppressive hierarchical structures to subjugate racially minoritized peoples. Another really big one is obviously plantation politics, which is basically the understanding that because the U.S. was based within slave societies and slavery and anti-blackness, all of our institutions, including higher education institutions, are based within those slave society politics and those plantation politics. As Stewart writes, the very system of institutionalized learning and oppression was created on the lands of slave societies, and as such, most higher education institutions function within the principles of plantation politics. So when I'm talking about the plantation politics of Hamilton College, I'm talking about the ways that Hamilton College demonstrates and practices and is committed to these different politics and social structures that were based around the plantation, around the subjugation of Black people. Part of this also means that I refer to student activist movements as rebellions, which is part of the theory behind plantation politics. This is to note how these acts of disruption and open defiance against administrative and police authority trigger the fears of those in power at universities as they scramble to reestablish what they view as order, contain the movement and emotions of Black folks, and mitigate white anxiety. So when I refer to something as a rebellion in relation to student movements at Hamilton, I'm talking specifically about these these moments of strong activist movements and organizing where the students and also faculty and staff are really pushing against the institution, and the institution is being forced to take a lot of different actions to try and regain that control. Settler colonialism is obviously the other one that I'm really focused on, especially with reference to Hamilton's history, which I'll talk a little bit about after. Settler colonialism is a distinct form of colonialism. It is premised on displacing indigenes from or replacing them on the land, and it's a form of an invasion, which is a structure, not an event. And like in plantation politics, Leigh Patel argues that the politics and practices of higher education institutions in the United States are influenced and shaped by the historical connection between higher education and settler colonialism. And this is really big for Hamilton in particular because of its history, its very deep connection to settler colonialism. Some other pieces of literature that were really important that I just don't have the time to really delve into. Sarah Ahmed's work on diversity, equity, inclusion, which I'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation, was super, super important, especially living a feminist life and on being included. I also looked at Roderick Ferguson's We Demand, Patrick Wolf's work on settler colonialism. He's the one that says that it's an invasion and it's a structure, not an event. I also looked at Otherwise Worlds against settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, and against civility, the hidden racism and our obsession with civility, which becomes very relevant, particularly with the movement. And then Robin Kelly's work, and then Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's work with Toward What Justice, as I think about moving forward and what abolition looks like and what the future of higher education should look like. So let's get started on some history of Hamilton. So for those of you who don't know, Hamilton College sits on the ancestral lands of the Oneida Nation. Hamilton was originally the Hamilton Oneida Academy, and it was established by the missionary Samuel Kirkland, who was gifted the Oneida land by the newly formed U.S. government for his role in the American Revolution. Something that's really fascinating is he had actually promised to the Oneida people that he would never steal their land, but then of course once he's given the opportunity to just have their land for free, he takes it. Samuel Kirkland was incredibly anti-Indigenous, like most settler colonials. He once said that the reason why it is, I cannot fully read this. Nope, you can't read it either. Beautiful. The reason why it is necessary to make the school, i.e. Hamilton Oneida, contiguous on the one part is that the Indians cannot learn the language and manners of the English, but by hearing their language spoken and observing their manners. The chief reason why it is necessary to have the school contiguous to the Indians on the other part is that as the habits of savage life are at a very great remove from those of a civilized, to oblige the Indian youth suddenly to break off all of the former and adapt the latter will unavoidably tend to depress their spirits and either sink them into a torpid indifference or beget in them an utter dislike to the improvements and manners of a civilized life. If you're class of 25 and we're at the orientation that Eric and I gave in the beginning of the year, you probably recognize, or hopefully do recognize this quote because we talked about it then there as well. This, I think, is perfectly emblematic of the way that Kirkland saw Indigenous people and saw the Oneida people and saw his role as civilizing them. And obviously, I would hope that we all understand today the ways that this whole civilization of Indigenous peoples is actually incredibly anti-Indigenous and racist. And what this demonstrates is that Hamilton Oneida Academy, its purpose was one of violent assimilation and anti-Indigenous racism, and that legacy still very much exists today with Hamilton College, especially given that the college has done absolutely nothing to rectify this history. It has no relations with the Oneida people. No Oneida student has even graduated from Hamilton or Hamilton Oneida. By the time Hamilton Oneida ended, part of the reason why it ended was because Oneida students stopped going because they knew that it was like a racist institution that just wanted to end their livelihoods and end their ways of living. Kirkland College, which was the women's college of Hamilton for 10 years before it got destroyed, is also super important to the history of Hamilton in and of itself, and I can't go fully in depth into all the ways that it's important in the way that I would like to, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it because I think that its history is incredibly important to the history of rebellion at Hamilton. So prior to the creation of Kirkland College, Hamilton was expensive, elite, exclusive, male, traditional, and relatively isolated from the strong wind sweeping through the larger education system. When the Hamilton Board of Trustees set out to establish a women's college, they intended for Kirkland to be a carbon copy of Hamilton, a chance to replicate Hamilton only with women instead of men. And this is from Samuel Fisher Babbitt's book on Kirkland College. He was the first and only president of Kirkland College and a huge supporter of the institution. This, I think, is really emblematic of the ways that Hamilton has historically brought marginalized peoples into their folds without actually changing the structures of that institution. So when he says that Hamilton just wanted Kirkland to be a carbon copy of Hamilton, it's very demonstrative of the way that the way that Hamilton had no intentions of actually creating a women's college that would service them in the ways that they needed to be serviced, and especially service them in ways that those women in particular needed to be serviced, because something that Babbitt talks about a lot in his book is how Hamilton was expecting these women to be very docile. They were expecting them to want to become mothers and wives, and these women were very, very different because, as Babbitt explains, the social movements of the 50s and 60s had taken roots in Kirkland soil, excuse me. I think Babbitt puts it perfectly when he talks about what Hamilton did to Kirkland. Kirkland only existed for 10 years before Hamilton destroyed it and merged with it. He writes that the administration and board of Hamilton not only perpetuated an incredibly wasteful act, but they willfully destroyed a lively, respected, some would even say important college. In the final analysis, Hamilton was alarmed by the pace of change and threatened by the philosophy that was being put into educational practice at Kirkland. Hamilton's greatest crime was perhaps a failure of imagination, the failure to see the richness it might have in a diversity of practice and approach. The closing of Kirkland was a ridiculous thing to do, and it brought no credit to an otherwise quite decent, if sometimes provincial, institution. Again, I think Kirkland is a great demonstration of Hamilton's commitment to its legacy, which is oppositional to liberation and social transformation. It was so terrified by the transformation that Kirkland was bringing to the Hill that it decided to destroy the institution instead. So now let's get into the bulk of my research, which is, of course, looking at the actual rebellions. So the first rebellion that I'm looking at is the divestment movement, which existed roughly from 1982 to 1988. It was part of a larger national and global rebellion, although largely disconnected from and never as big as some of the other rebellions happening. This was in response to global pressure to have for the end of apartheid South Africa, and so the idea was if you are invested in any way to apartheid South Africa, to divest from that. And Hamilton was invested, and apparently some of the members of the Board of Trustees were also personally invested in South African companies. A general timeline, so there had been some work done prior to 1982, but the divestment movement really started in 82 when the Students for Divestment was created. And then it kind of just like existed for those 4 years, and it was doing work, but it wasn't like a huge, big thing. And for the most part, the institution kind of just ignored them. But this all came to head in spring 1986 when the group really started to radicalize, and they started to use shanties and protests and sit-ins and whatnot to pressure the college to divest. And then this climaxed in November of 1986 when 12 students were unilaterally suspended after occupying Buttrick Hall, where the president's office is, causing massive pushback against President Caravano and Dean of Students Jane Jervis, who would both eventually resign, as I'll explain later. And then by the fall of 1988, unfortunately, the divestment movement was largely non-existent because the rebellion had died with the suspensions. As I'll explain later, basically with the court case that happened and with all the suspensions and with the newly focus on President Caravano specifically, all of the energy had been lost and the divestment movement fell apart basically without ever actually divesting from South Africa. I was about to say fossil fuels, which is a different thing. So they changed their name. They changed their name a couple times. It's actually really difficult to follow. But their main name that they use ends up being Hamilton Students, Faculty, Workers for Divestment, or HSFWD. So their tactics primarily had to do with protests and shanties, and then consciousness raising and education. So they started using shanties in spring of 1986. I'll have an image of a shanty later, but these are basically these were to demonstrate and reflect the ways that Black South Africans were living, and I think it started at Columbia University and then became a whole thing across the country. They also had protests at Board of Trustee meetings, both on campus and in New York City. They had protests at commencement, at class and charter day, and there were lots of sit-ins and occupations of offices and buildings. And then, of course, there were also a lot of teach-ins, speeches, programming, and other events. Most of them were organized in part by faculty members, and they had regular pieces in the Spectator. Seriously, I spent like literally months just looking at Spectator pieces about divestment specifically. It was a lot. So this is an image from Peggy Field, who was a class of '86 and a member of HSFWD. This on the left here, these are some faculty members at commencement holding a Divest Now poster, and on the right here is one of the shanties outside of the Alexander Hamilton statue. This shanty actually was technically approved by the college because there was a whole thing that went on that required that the college and HSFWD had to enter into negotiations because the courts would no longer allow the college to keep giving the students temporary restraining orders. And so to try and have a little bit more control over the shanties, the college allowed the organization to have the shanties up during commencement week and alumni week. And then they had to take it down. So this shanty was technically allowed by the institution, although they were not happy about it. One alumni, who was also one of the folks that got suspended, described the college at this time as patronizing and disrespectful, a corporate culture disguised as an academic institution, and explained that the college didn't uphold the mission as an educational institution, including respecting the emotions of the students they accepted into the school. He described senior staff members in particular as dysfunctional in their role as a nurturer of ideas and protest, who went to corporate trustees and did their bidding at the end of the day. And again, many of these trustees apparently, or not many, but some of these trustees apparently had investments in South Africa. So some tactics of the college. They were quite unorganized in comparison to their responses to the social justice initiative and the movement. One of the things they did was they often partnered with the state, especially as HSFWD radicalized. They increasingly turned to the courts to give temporary restraining orders primarily. They also obviously consistently prioritized profit over people. President Caravano once said that in making investment decisions, the trustees cannot legitimately take into account anything other than relevant economic and legal factors. They also threatened students and faculty very often. There was, of course, the suspension of the 12 students. With the restraining orders, obviously, is also the threat of being arrested and facing legal consequences. They also threatened to fire professors for insubordination. A really funny story with one of the former faculty members that I interviewed from divestment. He was talking about how they said that he was going to be fired. He was at threat of being fired for insubordination for calling President Caravano an asshole. And he apparently responded and said, "No, I called him a motherfucker." And then went on to threaten the college with free speech lawsuits and stuff. So suffice it to say, no one actually got fired, but they were at threat of it. So something that's really important with the court cases and with the restraining orders is that he often, President Caravano that is, often argued there was a possibility of violence occurring, and that's how he got the restraining orders to be approved. And it's also kind of how he lost the use of the restraining orders, because obviously the courts realized there's no violence happening. Hamilton was one of the few relatively peaceful rebellions that was occurring at that time, and so the courts had stopped giving restraining orders, although with the caveat that they would be more than happy to give one if it did become violent. And this is really insignificant in the greater history of the connection between the state and institutions when it comes to student dissent. So Roger Ferguson in We Demand talks a lot about the ways that the state and universities started to partner after the 50s and 60s. And he writes that they started to convince the public that student activists and dissenters were potential criminals who, if unchecked, could disrupt the social order and were threats to democracy. So, with this supposed threat of violence, with this greater focus on trying to repress student dissenters via the state, we see that pattern happening at Hamilton. Actually, one of the laws that was established during this that actually ended up being one of the reasons why the main reason that the divestment folks won their suit was actually a law that was established for the sake of trying to better suppress student dissenters, but there was like a loophole that they were able to get around, and then all the college students started using that loophole to get around it. Eventually, the law was repealed. So basically what you have here is the state and university coalescing into a unified and integrated system of of control and repression of students and student dissent. And again, Hamilton, because it wasn't like a major national movement, or wasn't part of that national movement in the same way, didn't really have to deal with that as much, but it was definitely there. And then, of course, when thinking about profit over people, right, the refusal to prioritize life over finances, and especially to prioritize Black life over finances, is emblematic of racial capitalism, or the process of deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of another person. As I mentioned, some board members were connected to South African companies, and so the colleges and the board's commitments to racial capitalism and profit for the institutions significantly outweighed any responsibility they may have had in protecting and advocating for the lives of Black South Africans and with it Black people globally. Again, there wasn't time to really go in depth with it, but in my paper I talk about some of the experiences of Black people at that time, and having Black people on campus at that time, and having to deal with like white students yelling out that they are pro-apartheid and they think it's great and all these different things. And of course the college not responding. So again, this all came to head in November of 1986. It started first with Caravano making some racist and disrespectful remarks at a seminar and at a debate about divestment. Or sorry, it wasn't that Caravano made a remark at a seminar, but someone who was part of the seminar made some remarks, and then Caravano made some remarks at divestment. So then HSFWD and the Black and Latin Student Union came together, and they were going to have a sit-in, and the plan was just to basically ask Caravano to apologize. Except Caravano wasn't there. The deans knew that it was happening, so they closed Buttrick down early, so that technically it was an illegal occupation of the building because it wasn't open. And then Caravano refused to speak to the students on the phone. So in that night, the students decided to make it an occupation. The next morning, they were threatened with suspension. There was some confusion. They were like originally threatened with expulsion, and then they were threatened with suspension. So there was a little bit back and forth there. And then, of course, there was the threat of the what is it called? Temporary restraining order. And this led to the unilateral suspension of 12 of the students who decided to stay back and continue to occupy the building. It's funny because there was also an alumni there, and so originally they had tried to suspend the alumni because they didn't know that he was an alumni. So it was originally like the 13 students, and then it became the 12. And with it, again, the students ended up bringing a suit against the college, and while they did initially lose, they won on appeal, and the college just basically let it go. Not that they let it go, but rather there wasn't really a way to argue against it. And Caravano, Jarvis, and Dean of the college, Marvin Endy, all resigned that summer. So this is a really interesting case because technically divestment was unsuccessful. The college never divested from South Africa, and it's not really clear what happened with those investments. But there was this huge cultural shift that kind of occurred because of the fact that you had 3 major senior staff members, including the president of the college, basically forced into resignation. And for the next 20 years almost, there was relative quiet and not really much student rebellion or student activism that happened during that time. And then in 2007, the Social Justice Initiative started. And this lasted until 2010, although there was some work that happened a little bit after 2010. And SJI primarily grew out of a number of racist events and attacks that had happened in the spring of 2007, and that was continuing to happen throughout the 2007 and 2008 school year. This was also during President Obama's election, and so there was a lot of national context happening as well. The trigger, however, was that in spring of 2007, someone keyed the car of a white female student with the phrase "nigger lover" because she was dating a black man. I don't think anything ever actually came out of that because they never found out who did it. And the college never really did much about it. SJI's primary goal was the creation of a cultural education center, which today is now the Days Masolo Center, or the DMC. They wanted a new cultural and educational space that would allow marginalized students to feel safe and for students to learn about cultural and political issues. One of the reasons why this was such a big deal at this time is because the Women's Center, which used to have its own building kind of, although I think it was specifically in the attic, was about to be destroyed. Rainbow Alliance met in what has been described to me as a literal closet in one of the dorms, and the Afro-Latin Cultural Center had not been renovated in a very long time, and it was not fit to actually be a large space for students to gather, and so students weren't really using it. This is an image of the Women's Center before it got destroyed. This is Amy, who was a member of SJI. Some of the tactics that they used, so similar to divestment, they did have protests, they had teach-ins, they used campus discourse through the Spectator, although not nearly as much. They also had tables, and they did tabling, so they would set up tables across campus and speak to community members who were both against and for SJI. And they had coffee hours, which were basically just weekly meetings where they talked about a lot of the issues that happened. The first coffee hour was always mentioned to me because they did a privilege line, and it was really popular, and they had the Dean of Students, Nancy Thompson, was there, and some other members of administration were there, and it really is part of what really started the movement itself. And they also, more than any of the rebellions that I'll be looking at, actually worked within the institution. And part of that is because they depended on the institution to create the CEC. They depended on the institutions to give the resources and funding for the CEC. Importantly, at this time, the same year that SJI was created, we had the creation of the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, or AHI, which we'll be talking about again during the movement. AHI was established by 3 Hamilton professors. The main person is Bob Paquette, who is a former Hamilton history professor, and he's still the current president of AHI. It opened up down the hill after the college refused to open the Alexander Hamilton Center, and it's essentially a right-winged think tank. AHI immediately was opposed to SJI and continues to be opposed to basically every social justice movement on campus. Dexter was a very short-lived student publication that, although not part of AHI in the way that Enquiry is, which is the current student publication in relation to AHI, they had heavy connections to AHI, and AHI often promoted their work and vice versa. The editors were publicly and outspokenly opposed to SJI and wrote about SJI in the CEC in 2 of the issues they published. I think they published 3 issues, but I can never find the 3rd issue. So like I said, very, very short-lived. At one point, they referred to SJI as having ludicrous hypersensitivity because of how they were responding to some remarks made by the Board of Trustees against them. For a publication that only had 2 issues that's on record, they wrote a lot about SJI. And the editors specifically wrote about SJI, not even they had people write about them. It was the editors speaking about them. Some important interactions that happened with senior staff members. So Dean of Faculty Joe Ergo was described as particularly oppositional and difficult to work with. He refused to allow students to speak at faculty meetings. It's not sure if this was the policy prior to this, although it is a policy now, I know from my own personal experiences. And, he was part of this systemic silencing of students and a disallowing them from creating these connections with faculty members. And so the SJI put on a silent protest at a faculty meeting, and they did eventually make connections with faculty members, but it was much harder to do so because of Joe Ergo. While he was acting president of the college, because the president was on a sabbatical, he refused to shut down the Mexican Party, which was this really offensive party that was being run by one of the Greek organizations, and apparently had told students that he would have allowed an N-word party because he believed so much in free speech, and he would have protected free speech above everything. So of course we have the protection of free speech above the safety of marginalized students. And he told members of SJI that he was helping them by always challenging them, even though he literally never helped them in any way whatsoever. It was always just saying no to them. President Joan Hines Stewart had also made inappropriate remarks to black female students regularly who were part of SJI, and once told a black male member that she preferred speaking with him over the woman of color in the group because he was articulate and non-militant. And then Dean of Student Nancy Thompson was described as someone who wasn't necessarily oppositional, but she couldn't handle racial justice issues. She apparently often cried in meetings and always tried to push the new Sadoff Student Activities Building, which is the one that's where it is now, to be the CEC. So she demonstrated a consistent, whether or not it be intentional, a deep misunderstanding of what the CEC was supposed to be. There was something else I wanted to mention. Oh, she did, though, keep up her promise to renovate the ALCC when the students brought it up, although they never installed computers, which was one of the demands. But they did renovate the ALCC, and it was much better because she agreed to it. So now let's look at the actual creation of the Days Masolo Center, or the DMC. So in the second year of SJI's existence, suddenly the college kind of changed its tune and started to actually be receptive to the idea of a CEC. It's not entirely sure why that happened, although many of the alumni that I spoke with feel that it's because it was becoming more of a norm for colleges to have CECs. So in the second year, it had become more socially and economically beneficial for the college to have its own cultural educational center. So on November 4th, 2008, which is actually the day that Barack Obama got elected, which was described to me as a kind of poetic event, the student assembly and the faculty both passed resolutions fully supporting a cultural education center. And then that January, the Strategic Planning Committee for Hamilton established the CEC task force, which was meant to find a potential building to be the CEC and to think about what a CEC would actually look like at Hamilton. And then on October 2nd of 2009, the Board of Trustees officially approved the creation of the CEC to be named after Arthur Masolo and Drew Days, both of whom are alumni and members of the trustees, although Drew Days recently passed away. And so that's how we got the Days Masolo Center, or the DMC. Immediately, there was an exclusion of SJI from this work, even though they were the ones who had been driving it. The organization had not at all been recognized as the driving force behind the creation of the CEC, and the college has never even officially recognized them until 2021, when the current director of the DMC, Paola Lopez, started to work with SJI and started to get them recognized. And so now they have a really nice plaque in the DMC, and the DMC regularly puts on different events with SJI members. And then only one member of SJI and a supportive faculty member were part of the CEC task force. So even the literal task force that's supposed to be based off, or supposed to actually help see come to life this cultural education center that these students had fought for, didn't actually include students. Which brings me to my next point, which is that the DMC, for as amazing as it is, and as someone who has used the DMC, has found the DMC as a safe space throughout my time at Hamilton, it is not only much weaker than what the SJI had envisioned, but it has become an embodiment and manifestation of the ways in which racial justice rebellions within white institutions are co-opted and destroyed by the institutionalization of diversity. And actually, some of the faculty members who were supportive of SJI, who I spoke with, talked about warning the SJI students that they had to be very careful with creating a CEC because there was a very high possibility that it would be essentially destroyed because of this institutionalization of diversity. So some eras of the DMC, it's kind of gone through 3 eras because of the constant change in directors. So the first era, was under the director Amit Taneja, who we'll talk a little bit about later. It was almost entirely political and educational, and it was as close to the original intentions of the CEC as it has ever been historically. After he retired, or not retired, but after he resigned, it went 5 years without an official director, and as such, there was very little time and energy placed into it because its interim director had like a whole other job, and so obviously she couldn't run the DMC. It was almost entirely cultural. It put on only a couple events every month, which had been a significant reduction from the center under Amit. And it was the furthest from the vision of SJI. And now, under his current director, there's more of a combination of culture and politics, and it's closer to what SJI imagined, but it's still not there. And it is now the crown jewel of DEI at Hamilton. When you go on like the diversity page on Hamilton, it's like one of the first things that you see after their whole like mission statement with regards to diversity. It really is, the best way to describe it really is the crown jewel of DEI at Hamilton. Which leads me to thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion as a concept. And this is where Sarah Ahmed's work really comes in. First, I want to think about DEI as a mask. So as Ahmed writes, DEI can be used as masks to create the appearance of the institution being transformed. It can be used, or efforts to transform institutions can be used by institutions as evidence that they have been transformed. The DMC came out of student rebellion, and the institution now uses it as evidence that it has been transformed and that it continues to transform while historically never recognizing its origin. It has taken the labor of Black students and other students of color and or otherwise marginalized backgrounds, and for over a decade has been using that original labor and also the labor of students after SJI who are part of DMC organizations to appear progressive and transformative without, of course, ever actually making the transformations that students were fighting for and advocating for. As Lay Patel argues, DEI is just another arm of whiteness and white supremacy, and articulations of diversity and inclusion allow institutions to proclaim a dedication for diversity, but hold at bay substantive change to unhouse whiteness in higher education. And so when we think about DEI in white institutions like Hamilton, it's not being used for the purpose of actually bringing about equity or inclusion, but rather to make the institution seem as though it cares about those things. And when you look at DEI policies, those policies tend to be very surface level, and they don't actually get at the root of what is causing these issues. And also DEI is often used to control social transformations. So as Ferguson talks about with the combination of like the state and the university and thinking about diversity, folding diversity into the bureaucratic machine and moving it up into the administration, as in like the administration of an institution, was one way of mitigating student demands and preventing them from becoming matters of social transformation. So another thing that he talks about is this ombudsman. And when I think about Hamilton, I think about having a kind of collective ombudsman. And an ombudsman has the responsibility to take demands that might push against the university's institutional order and bring them within that order to, as the theorist Sarah Ahmed has put it, make students cease to cause trouble. So these positions, these DEI positions, whether it be the director of the DMC or the new chief diversity officer or what have you, these are not meant to be radical positions. They're not meant to be radical offices. They're not meant to actually address the root causes of injustice at Hamilton. In fact, they are meant as ways for the college to have greater control over marginalized community members, and as such, so that the college can better ensure that rebellions are stifled. And by placing the responsibility of DEI into a number of positions and offices, they can use those positions and offices to get closer to students and build those relationships with those students through those positions and offices, and then build those relationships with the college. So, again, DEI is not a step to rectify the history of racism. It's meant to increase the bottom lines of institutions. It is something that is put into the service of whiteness and becomes a form of social control or method by which deviancy is eliminated, reduced, or rendered harmless. With the DMC, an Associate Dean of DEI, a VP for DEI, and similar positions, the college is able to reinforce power and wealth via its policies and practices within these positions and offices. And just to go back for a moment in terms of using these positions to have more control over students, I think the DMC is another great example because the most historically radical organizations like the Black and Latinx Student Union, the Feminists of Color Collective, the Center for Intersectional Feminism, they all exist within the DMC, which means that no matter who is the director of the DMC or assistant director, whoever is part of these official positions by the college, they automatically have more influence over those students, and as such could have more influence over what those students do, including whether or not they rebel. And via those positions like the director of the DMC, the college then has more influence over those students. And so it doesn't matter how great or wonderful a person is within that position or how dedicated they are to this work or whatever the case is, these positions are ultimately tools of the college to reestablish and ensure they have as much control as possible over students who might rebel. So finally, I want to talk about the movement. The movement existed from 2013 and 2016 and is probably the most fascinating rebellion in Hamilton's history. It was one of the first ones that I learned about. It was an entirely anonymous and exclusive organization, so you had to be invited into it. And it began out of both national and campus-based racist events and experiences. 2013, 2014, this is the Black Lives Matter movement, the Ferguson uprisings. This is the national context that these students are existing within. The rebellion was an accident in many ways, as the original founders had never intended to begin one. They were simply responding to the racial tensions on campus and nationally and the anger and harm they were facing at the hands of both the country and the college. So basically the way that the movement started was one night after this major event, which I'll talk about in a moment, a group of Black and brown students and friends were together in one of the rooms in the DMC. No one could quite figure out which room it was, but it was in one of the rooms in the DMC, were together and they were talking about their experiences and they were talking about how they were feeling in that moment. And someone was like, you know what, we should just chalk the place and we should put up all kinds of posters. And so they did that and they spent the entire night, they were like wearing all black and they were like hiding from cameras and just chalking everything and putting up all kinds of posters. And then the next morning, everyone woke up to suddenly this whole thing. So there were a couple different triggers for the movement. One of them being this Real Talk dialogue series that was supposed to be put on by Amit Taneja, who was the director of the DMC at the time. This is literally like right out the creation of the DMC. Like this is his first semester, one of the first events that he's putting on. As explained to me by one of the students that worked for him, this came out of what he saw as a need for students to be able to talk about internalized racism within their own communities. And so it was going to be a 3-part series. The first part was going to have only people of color. The second part was going to have only white people, and the third part was going to have everyone. Obviously, this was not okay to most white students. And Dean Ball, who was the president of the Alexander Hamilton Institute undergraduates program, sent out an all-campus email. This was back when students had all-campus email access. And he argued that this was an act of segregation and that AHI would be having their own meeting at the same time, that it would not be a safe zone. He also had went to the DMC and, according to a student who was there, essentially verbally assaulted Amit. So there was this kind of systemic disrespect of Amit Taneja and this refusal to create programming to actually allow students of color to talk about the issues that they wanted. Like students of color were asking for this kind of programming. Amit Taneja was doing his job and of course got immediate backlash. Something else that was happening is that there were 2 different anonymous platforms being used at the time to perpetuate a lot of racism. One of them being Yik Yak, which was an app, and the other one being a Facebook page run by a Hamilton student called Hamilton Secrets. So I apologize for the it's very blurry. I don't have any control over that. These were sent to me blurry. So these are some Yik Yak posts that were saved. This one on the left basically says, it says, this is what happens when whites give blacks special opportunities to study at our institutions. White liberals are digging their own graves. They're now beginning to reap what they sow. And this is in reference to the creation of the movement. The second one is laughing at a poster that the movement had put up saying that they stand with Yale, which was going through their own racial justice movement. And then the response is calling movement members a ableist slur that I will not say, but it starts with an R, so hopefully you can guess that. These are from Hamilton Secrets, the Facebook page, talking about how the movement should push for a mandatory course for all students of color to teach them how to obey law and order. This is, of course, in the midst of the Ferguson protests and everything. And then talking about how Mike Brown's murder wasn't actually a murder because the person was acting in self-defense. There are also posts about like celebrating black people being murdered and all kinds of things. It's not at all a nice page to be on. During this time, there was also a lot of firing and non-contract renewal of many faculty members of color. And so a lot of the more radical faculty members of color that were more supportive of students were being fired or not having their contracts renewed. And so this was causing a lot of pushback from the movement as well. I have a part of an interview that I did with a faculty member who was fired. I had to pitch the voice, so I apologize if it's a little bit odd, but. Oh no, I don't think hold on. Oh no. Okay.
For me, I wasn't acting as neither as an tenured faculty. I was just simply acting as a faculty, and I believed because I believed in that, and I believed in the students' needs. Did I think that that could affect my future on Hamilton College? In the same way that perhaps some actions may hurt your future, your tenured future at any other institution? I didn't think so, because as I mentioned to you before, Saphire, I was doing what I thought then and what I still think now. Any faculty, whether you are a distinguished assistant professor, an adjunct, a distinguished faculty, a tenured faculty, untenured faculty, should do for all of the students. I don't care if you're Asian, Latino, Hispanic, black of any denomination, or white, it doesn't matter. That's just what faculty, I think, that's what we're supposed to do. Did it affect my future at Hamilton College? I didn't think it would. And at the beginning, I didn't think it did until the end. When I found out that my contract was not going to be renewed. When the reason given for my contract not being renewed was that the college was having budget issues for a private, wealthy, endowed institution to have budget issues to renew a contract for such insignificant positions, you know. I don't think Hamilton College was short $100,000. I don't think so. Like, it doesn't matter how you break it down to me. That's just not the reason. I think that was an excuse. And it was an excuse because I found out later that other faculty had complain about my involvement with students. And I think some of the exact comments, for example, made was that I would meet with students in the, what's it called, is it the multicultural house still? The DMC. The DMC, right? That I would meet with the student on a regular basis at the DMC. No, but the DMC is not Venice Software. No, right. So it's the other one to the right. So that I would meet with students several times to, what was the word used? To instigate with the students.
Yeah, so these are some images of some of the posters that the movement put up. As you can see, these ones are with specific reference to the different, nope, that's not what I wanted, hold on. With specific reference to the different movements that were happening across other colleges and campuses. And then this is, again, at the Alexander Hamilton statue, which is favored by rebellions, calling for diverse faculty members. Something that the movement also did often was bring awareness to different experiences of students. So they had a Tumblr page where they would put up where people could submit their different experiences. They also often, in their different protests and whatnot, would have students talk about their experiences. And so one member that I spoke to talked about his own experience in his first year, which he talked about with the movement, and he shared as part of the movement, where he was walking down the bridge on Martin's Way. And it was late night, and he ran into two drunk white men who yelled out, "Fuck the movement," and proceeded to try and throw him over the bridge. And he was about halfway down the bridge before someone had stopped what was happening. So these were the experiences of Black students, of queer students. There were a lot of, during this time, there were a lot of attacks against queer students also. And other marginalized students happening at this time. And the movement wanted to bring awareness to these experiences as much as they could. AHI also was obviously against the movement, and almost every alumni that I spoke to talked about remembering Enquiry, which is the student publication for the AHI undergraduate fellows, as particularly oppositional to the movement. And I found records of at least 5 pieces in the Enquiry about the movement, and at least 2 pieces published by members of AHI, Dr. Briquette, and resident fellow of AHI, Dr. Mary Graybar. And in the Enquiry pieces, AHI undergraduate fellows accused members of the movement of publicly embarrassing the college, referred to its demands as childish and arrogant, and the students involved as a screaming group of petty totalitarians. In one of their pieces, they were welcoming David Whitman and specifically talked about how they hoped that he would put an end to the movement. The end of the movement came with the publishing of their demands. So this is an email sent from Joan Hines Stewart to the entire campus community, and attached to it are the demands. This is just the first section of the demands. The reason why this was the end of the movement was because a first year, without permission from anyone else or without consultation from anyone else, had released the movement demands. And the reason why this was a big deal was because they weren't finished, and it wasn't something that was agreed upon by the entire movement. And as a non-hierarchical organization, that was incredibly important to them. And basically what happened, this is at the time also when there was a lot of internal conflict starting to come to a head. One of the reasons why this first year published it was because they felt like the movement was no longer as radical as it needed to be. So there was a split in terms of what people thought the movement should be doing. There was a split across class years. People weren't as close with each other anymore. And so there just really wasn't a community within the movement anymore. And instead of addressing all of these issues, once the demands were released, that basically ended everything. They never even talked about it. They just never called a meeting again, and the movement ended. What's really interesting about these demands is while they obviously came out of a deep desire for actual transformation, they talk a lot about diversity and equity and inclusion, and a lot of what they focus on is this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as Robin Kelly writes, in Black Study, Black Struggle, there is a tension between desiring to belong and rejecting the university as a cog in the neoliberal order. What does it mean for Black students to seek love from an institution incapable of loving them, of loving anyone perhaps? These demands would not end the Black suffering the students experienced because the demands depended heavily on the reformation of the college, not the radical transformation of it. Similarly, or not similarly, but in response, the institution had these different community conversations about race. So the Real Talk Dialogue series was destroyed, never happened, and it was replaced with meaningful conversations and crucial conversations, which were these two different series of, again, just conversations about race. There was a lot of protection of free speech above all else, a lot of arguing for civility, and there were no policy changes except for the creation of the social, structural, and institutional hierarchies requirement, which is kind of known as the diversity requirement, which I'm sure, as many of you know, isn't a very effective requirement today. The reason why I wanted to point out these conversations about race is because it's common for colleges and universities to attempt to create a perception of dealing with concerns, again, kind of like with DEI, and making changes via these events or programming. It's one of the strategies of the institution that Barnhart, Cassie Barnhart, whose work I base some of my research on, and many others identify, which is concessions, and concessions specifically that are just cosmetic rebranding in the form of new hires, committees, and initiatives. And it allows the institution an opportunity to present these sessions as examples of benevolence or acting out of genuine concern and care. This is an email from Dean of Students Nancy Thompson, sent out to the all-campus community in 2015. So it would have been like about the height of the movement, talking about how, yes, you have free speech, but you also need to be civil, and rudeness isn't persuasive, and it might cause people to not listen. This is really important because, as Alex Zavalin argues, civility, I cannot read out of it. Civility is something through which racial inequality has been maintained. It is exalted in the language of slaveholders, segregationists, lynch mobs, and eugenicists. It is also enshrined in the language of free marketeers and preachers of fiscal responsibility. From slavery to Jim Crow to Black ghettoization to mass incarceration to police brutality, the idea of civility has been enlisted to treat Black suffering with apathy or to maintain the status quo. Worse, it has been a tool for silencing dissent, repressing political participation, enforcing economic inequality, and justifying violence upon people of color. Similarly, along those lines, Barnhart talks about the ways that universities will often turn student dissent into a public debate over how the students raised their issues. And so obviously we can't know that Nancy Thompson was purposefully doing this, but it is a strategy that is often used by institutions to start a conversation about whether or not someone is being angry or rude or what have you, and then the conversation shifts from the actual issues at hand to the behavior of the folks that are bringing out those issues. And then, of course, nothing actually gets solved. Recent attempts at rebellion, so I cannot go over all of this because there's just not enough time, but if you're more interested in learning about these specific recent attempts, you can read my paper. Again, I'll have a sign-up sheet over here. So the reason I call it recent attempts is because none of these have actually become full-fledged rebellions, and part of that is because of the pandemic, especially with these first two over here. The pandemic really ended the divestment movement for the most part. Hopefully it'll come up again. and a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff that had happened. So first, in 2019, we have the creation of Sunrise Movement and the reestablishment of the divestment from fossil fuels. There had been some work being done in 2014, 2015 to divest from fossil fuels, but it kind of died off. So there were a couple different strikes that happened in 2019 into 2020, calling for the divestment from fossil fuels. Like with divestment from South Africa, the college has not done anything. It has taken the same line that like there isn't enough economic value and there's too much put at risk if you divest. And then in 2020, specifically in summer of 2020, you have the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole advisory council fiasco, which again, I'm sorry if you don't know exactly what that means. I can explain that later, you can read my paper. And then the creation of the Audit and Action Council, which I helped establish as president of the student body. And then recently there's been the Admissions Student Union and continued unionization efforts across the student body workforce at Hamilton, which has been really great. And then the most recent one is Our Hamilton, which is a reckoning with the Alexander Hamilton Institute and targeted harassment. These last two are still in progress. So we have yet to see whether or not they'll become full-fledged rebellions and also what the impacts of their existence will be. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about justice and equity and what our future of higher education looks like when you want to create an institution or system that is actually liberatory. So Michael J. Dumas argues that what counts as justice in education in no way promises an end to Black suffering. It may alleviate or mitigate some suffering for some Black students in some educational spaces, but the vast majority of Black children and their families will still continue to experience suffering. And similarly, Patel, in another essay, argues that justice has been so thoroughly leached of meaning that its constant utterance do the work of hierarchy and power. That is not to say that justice must always be entangled in injustice, but that societies created to operate under logics of coloniality have developed sophisticated, complex invocations of justice that are lackeys to the purposeful injustice of hierarchical creation and the sequestering of resources. So again, if we think of DEI, for example, I hope that I have demonstrated that DEI, no matter the intentions of people who might be in those offices or positions, is ultimately used as a tool to continue the injustice, to continue Black suffering, to ensure that social transformation doesn't actually happen. So then what does that mean for us? That means that what we need to envision, ultimately, is an end to all of this. The destruction of the very conditions of Black suffering, which is necessarily the end of schooling as we understand it, and in the meantime, a perpetual troubling of what gets celebrated as racial justice in education and what is imagined as the just ends for our work in the field. Ultimately, what we need is the abolition of higher education as we know it. The difficulty of and beauty in creating a new education system which is committed to liberation and freedom is that the system must be created by and center those who have been historically oppressed. As Paulo Freire argues, we need an educational project which prioritizes the behavior, view of the world, and ethics of the oppressed, to create a system where students undermine the power of oppression and serve the cause of liberation. We need a vision of self-empowerment for students which conjoins education and learning with the ability to serve their communities so that they can actually radically transform the materiality and end their suffering. Thank you very much. There's a question and answer session. I don't know if you want to mediate it. Okay. I'm just going to sit. Oh, I realized we should see if there are questions in the chat. Hold on. Okay. Michaela asks, why do you think the climate at Hamilton is so hostile to change activism in comparison to other campuses? Thank you, Brenda. I talk about that a lot with my friends, honestly. I think part of it is because it's so isolated and small, and Hamilton, for the most part, is able to really get away with doing whatever it wants because more often than not, it's not going to be talked about in national news. So I think, for example, when when they had like those suicides on campus a couple years back, there was the New York Times article, and that resulted in essentially creating a whole new health center, which still isn't really helpful, but that was a moment where there was a lot of pressure and the institution had to do something, similar to, the resignations of Caravano and Jervis and other folks. So I think part of it is because it's such a small and isolated institution that it's kind of, I hate to say that it exists within a bubble, but it really does exist within a bubble, and that allows it to get away with things. I think there's also just a culture, there's this thing called the Hamilton Cool, which I don't think is a term that's really used anymore, but it used to be used a lot. And it basically described the ways that Hamilton students never cared about anything. So there's also this long culture of Hamilton students historically never caring about anything. And I think part of that is also that there used to be a very militarized culture, that there was a very heavy Greek life culture, that there was a very heavy party culture. And it's really only been in like the last 50 years that Hamilton has become more of an elite institution. So there's this historical culture and legacy of Hamilton being an institution that doesn't really take things seriously. And also it's a very white institution. And so these, and a lot of the white people that come here are white people that have been isolated for their entire lives. And so they just perpetuate this consistent isolation, which I think makes it incredibly hostile and makes it very difficult to get work done.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
As it's isolated, it's in an area where no one's going to point these things out either.
Right.
So it's not isolated because the area actually is very comfortable with how Hamilton conducts itself,
Yeah.
Yeah, so one question I have, and I hesitate to ask this because it sort of gets away from some of the issues, specific issues of race and white supremacy, but it's more about the way the issue of activism at a college, but that the cycle you describe, that you get these bursts of activism and then it falls off. And one of the challenges, and again, the issues you raise are maybe much bigger than this, but one challenge is that since you only have undergraduates here, there seems to be a cycle where students will get involved somewhat their first year and then their sophomore year, then it sort of fades off as they go through junior and senior years. So, I mean, this sort of relates to Michaela's question, also comparing Hamilton to other institutions. It seems that a lot of institutions where activism is sustained are universities with their grad students who can sort of carry the institutional memory. And so how, on a college campus, could that institutional memory and drive be sustained from like cohort to cohort?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest issues with Hamilton is that there is no institutional history. There is no recorded institutional history, and that's part of why I wanted to do this. I mean, it took 8 months for me to get the information that I have. And there's still probably so much information that I'm missing out on. And there is no recorded There is no record of these different things. And when there's no record, that obviously means that students who come in don't know that this exists. And so, when I came in, right, like I thought that I was going to be entering into a much more activist institution. I didn't find out until probably like a month in more about the history of the Center for Intersectional Feminism, and that was when I decided to get involved because it has a lot of deep history with Kirkland College. And it wasn't until my second year that I started to learn more about the history of the Black and Latinx Student Union and the Feminists of Color Collective, even though I was literally part of those organizations. And still today, I'm still learning all kinds of new things about different organizations on campus in ways that we used to be very active on campus. I think, for example, there's an event that FCC usually puts on that I found out recently had actually been a whole other separate thing prior to before FCC took it on. Blue Vinyl, if any of you remember it. And I learned that from my teacher in high school who happened to be a Hamilton alum who helped run that event. So there's all this disconnect between the experiences that people had and what is on record and what's not on record, and these histories just have not been documented. And I think part of that is intentional, because if these histories are documented, if they're shared with students, then obviously, hopefully, the response and the consequence is that students, when they do want to start movements and they do want to become organizers, are going to be much more organized and much more on top of their shit because they know the history. And that just doesn't exist. And I think that that's a huge issue at Hamilton. And I think that one of the ways that we can that we can fight that is by documenting these histories as much as possible. I think also it's so incredibly important for students to build connections with faculty members, because they're here for much longer than we are. They have much more institutional history than we do by the nature of the fact that they are here for so long. And so I think also thinking about how are we connecting with faculty members and building those relationships. Same with alumni. I don't think that Hamilton loves to talk about like networking with alumni, but it never talks about building connections with alumni to actually aid in other ways outside of the career. And again, with my work, what is the word I'm thinking of? I can't think of the word I'm thinking of. Privileged, I guess, in that I've been able to make these deeper connections with alumni and be able to make those connections outside of career, outside of academics, but thinking about our own experiences as organizers. And so I think, that's something that Hamilton just struggles with. I think because of culture, I think because it's intentional on behalf of the institution, it's like impossible to get connected with alumni in ways that are not directly connected to the institution. And of course, the moment you bring the institution into establishing that relationship, it's not going to be what you want it to be. It's going to be very focused on however the institution wants it to be. And so I think that, probably those are the two main ways that we can start to combat this inability to really sustain the work. I think documenting the work and sharing that knowledge and institutional history with new students as they come in, and building those relationships with alumni and faculty members.
Something I was also thinking about was, like, you kind of mentioned towards the end of Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, and, like, how Black and Latinx, how BLSU ended up, organized on that entire fundraiser. And within that, you had a lot of sports team and just, like, white folk in general, kind of donating to these organizations, right? And almost like participating in performative activism and stuff like that. And throughout my time here, like, I think that I've just really noticed that from, like, we live on a predominantly white institution. Basically every white person on this campus is heavily invested in performative activism. So I think in thinking also just like almost adding on to like the question about how do we continue these movements, right? Like, yes, I know that like the pandemic definitely impacted the Black Lives Matter movement and like the activism that was kind of, the radical awakening that was kind of emerging on this campus again because of that. But also, like, do you feel that performative activism on behalf of white folk on this campus also contributes to the ending of these movements? And if so, like, do you think that there's a fix, especially living on such an elitist and white institution?
With your specific example, I think, kind of demonstrates how sometimes it can be a little bit complex. Because yes, I do think that that fundraiser challenge that you're referencing, which I think we raised like over $32,000, on the one hand, it was very performative. It was coming out of a lot of white guilt. But on the other hand, we raised $30,000 for Black organizations. And so something good did come out of it. And I think that had we been able to really push that forward and continue that work. I went on a medical leave right after, so I wasn't able to continue the work. But had that work been continued, I think that we really could have potentially changed a couple people's minds and really get them involved in the work. And so I do think that there are moments where that performative activism can actually be really helpful. I remember when Biden won, there was a tweet talking about how it's in some ways actually not a good thing that he won because now a bunch of white liberals are going to stop doing whatever work they were doing beforehand. And so I think that, there's definitely some benefit in having that performative activism if they are actually doing something, right? Because that means that they are contributing in some way, shape, or form. But I think like that tweet kind of demonstrates, once that activism is lost, whatever that looked like, what you have now is just like a vacuum. And now you realized, oh, there were actually only like 5 people in this group of 20 that were dedicated. And now all the work has been placed on these 5 people. How are we supposed to move forward now? And, I think that part of the issue with that also is like there is something that I'm constantly struggling with is like, I fully believe that we need multiracial movements in order to make actual change. But also, like, I shouldn't be the one that's organizing white people because that's a lot of labor on myself. And so there's also this larger question of, like, white people have to be doing the work, too. And I think performative activism is really difficult because if you're in a situation, for example, where, like I said, there are 20 people, but only 5 people are actually committed, those 5 people are going to have a lot more labor than those other 15 people, and they can't, like, run whatever organization they're running or campaign or whatever, and also, like, fully educate those other 15 people so that they become core members. And so it's kind of a little bit an issue of, like, it's like, you can only bring the horse to the river or something, I don't know, something like that, where, like, you can only go so far, right? Like, at some point, these folks have to take responsibility for their own actions. And I'd say that's probably the most difficult part of performative activism, that there is some level of benefit that could come out of it, but ultimately it doesn't help. I'm gonna take one from the chat, and then we'll move on. So Jessica asks, what role does the institution need to play if it is meant to enact actual change and revolution in College Hill in a way that does not place the burden on students of color and other historically marginalized groups on campus? I think that is another really difficult one because, sorry, I was just checking if there are other ones. I just peeped something from my grandfather. That's going to be so embarrassing to look at later. I completely blanked. I think that, it's really difficult because on the one hand, we are students and we are here to learn and partake in this educational journey. But also, we're the ones who know best how to do the work. And so what I would say is, I think the best way that people who are working within the institution who genuinely want to help move forward or move liberation forward is to center students, and especially the most marginalized ones, and to follow the lead of those students. Especially if you're like a white person who hasn't really done that work very much and don't really know what you're doing, but you want to get more involved, the best thing for you to do is to follow the lead of the most marginalized peoples. I think also like figure out the ways that you have power and therefore can help students who don't have power. For the very few members of administration that, like administration being like all like directors and staff and not just senior staff, that I actually trust are folks that have demonstrated time and again that they are actually here for students and who have used their own power to support students in both like more organizational and more like logistical ways in terms of like institutional change, and also in more personal ways. I've had a couple different admin who have helped me on more personal ways. And I think also, again, thinking about like, what can I offer these different movements that would actually be really beneficial? So I think of faculty members, right? A lot of the faculty members that I spoke to talked about being very intentional to not take over these movements and to follow the lead of students and to let these be student movements. And what they often offered was that institutional history. So thinking about, what can I, as someone who has been at the institution for a while, as someone who has power, what can I offer students who are doing this work? How can I support them as much as I possibly can? Because I do think that ultimately, like Freire mentions, these movements have to be centered on and led by the most marginalized peoples. And so I do think that students, and especially the most marginalized ones, ultimately are going to do the bulk of the work in terms of actually transforming the institution. But if we're thinking about what can we do until then, I think people within the institution, thinking of staff and faculty, have a lot of power and have a lot of influence that they could be using.
So as you mentioned, the way that a lot of these movements and a lot of these rebellions are instigated or started are based off of specific moments in time. That there's a catalyst and there's context to them, like context, but there's also oftentimes, specifically like with our Hamilton movement, the situation with the letter and with Professor Durrani, that is a very big thing to have happened to have caused a movement. So how does a movement moving forward that is led by students move past their instigating moment, and how are they going to be able to maintain a rebellion and a movement beyond that, and be able to connect with the student body? Because as you mentioned, in years prior, these waves of activism end very abruptly because of either internal dispute or you've mentioned more of the administration taking power against, and the institution taking power against the students. How do students combat that alongside combating the issues of over time degradation and interest?
Yeah, I would say SJI is probably the best example that I could give of that happening. One of the reasons why I think SJI is definitely probably the most successful rebellion is largely in part because they were so committed to each other and to the work. So, you had this massive move, or you had this major event happen with the keying of the car and some other stuff that was happening. And in response to that, I mean, there was like immediate protest that happened in response to that like the Women's Center helped put together, which is now the Center for Intersectional Feminism, and stuff like that. But then you had people who wanted to see more, and as a result, they came together and they said, okay, what is this actually going to look like? How do we actually move forward from this? So they actually had conversations about how to move forward from it and how to establish an actual movement and an actual organization rather than just have this one-off protest that happened. And part of the reason why they were able to do that is because they were so committed to each other and they were so committed to the work. I mean, one of the folks that I interviewed literally almost started crying when they were talking about how much they loved SJI and how supportive everyone was. And that never really ended. SJI talked about not necessarily being good at recruitment, and I think that's part of the reason why the organization eventually ended. And also it wasn't an official Hamilton organization. And then of course, once you have the creation of the DMC, that starts to dilute it a little bit. But for the people who were part of SJI, especially for the people who were doing like the majority of the work, I mean, they were incredibly dedicated to each other. They were incredibly dedicated to the work. They were also very big on giving as much information as they possibly could and being as non-hierarchical as they possibly could. They were very big on not having like actual leaders. And as I mentioned, two of their main tactics were those SJI coffee hours and those tabling matters. So they were always speaking with students and faculty and staff about the things that were concerning them with Hamilton. Sometimes those conversations had to do with, why those folks didn't think that SJI should exist. But a large part of the time, it was thinking about what students wanted and needed. And I think that was the other really big thing, is that the Cultural Education Center had become their primary focus after having conversations with other students about what people wanted and needed. And it was determined through those conversations, through those meetings, through, sometimes screaming matches. It was determined that the Cultural Education Center was the biggest thing and was the best way that they could move forward. And that just didn't happen with a lot of the other movements that I looked at. Like I said, the movement fell apart very quickly. One of the reasons why it completely ended was because they never even addressed what happened. They just never called another meeting, and it ended. Divestment, I only got to speak to 10 folks, and only 2 of them were Black, so I didn't even really get to speak to many Black students who were part of it. But even though it was definitely there was more of a community, there also didn't seem to be too much of a dedication to the larger issues at hand. Some of the folks I spoke to talked about seeing it as more of a way to kind of say like F you to the institution than anything. And so SGI really was the first and only time, or I should maybe not say first, but one of the firsts, and definitely I think the only time in recent history, recent being within the last decade or so, where you had students really come together and have those really difficult conversations about what it means to have a movement and what it means to be part of a movement. And that just didn't happen with the other rebellions, and I don't think that it has happened in the same ways and as at length as SJI with the newer attempts.
Yeah, I just want to point out in your answer, you used the word love. And I think that's an important part of the answer to your question, is that the people who are coming together have to genuinely love being together, talking to each other, and working together. And I think when it's too much about the work and not about love, then it's likely that people will stop showing up when other things come up versus coming back because you want to be with those people. So how to cultivate that? It sounds like tabling and coffee hours, right? More interactional time with each other, talking about the things that matter. And so that creates those bonds, I'm assuming, that lasted so long.
And they spend a lot of time with each other as well.
Yeah, I have a quick question, I guess, about divestment. You mentioned that there are some board trustees that had personal ties to apartheid. Were you able to find through your documents or your discussions which trustees, or was it kind of just alluded to?
No, it was something that was alluded to. If there are any records, they're not in the archives, and with divestment especially, if they're not in the archives, I'm probably not going to be able to find it because it was, now 30-something plus years ago. So it was just something that was brought up in interviews that I did with alumni members.
Yeah, amazing. So one thing that I've really noticed through this entire presentation and looking into some of this stuff myself is how administration gets more sophisticated in its responses to student rebellions over time. Just as much as students are learning, administration is learning how to confront and quell these rebellions. So today, what do you see as the honed strategic approach that administration has to suppress students when they're critiquing the college, both through your own experiences and also through your research? And as a sub-question, because I know you're going to mention it, as relates to DMC and so on, how do students set those boundaries that defend their autonomy from structures like the Dean of Students Office and the entirety of our TBI programs from co-optation? How do you set that boundary? What do students need to do to both those questions?
Yeah, I think that There are a range of tactics, I think, that are used heavily today. One that you mentioned, co-optation, and thinking about, trying to fold, which is the term that Roger Ferguson uses, fold these issues into the institution and trying to make it that the institution is going to handle whatever is going on. And in that way, they can have more control over what's happening, and ensure that, whatever moves forward actually isn't very radical. So I think of the advisory council, for example, trying to solve this issue that came up with Black Lives Matter through this council that ultimately did nothing and didn't really have students involved in all these different things, but it was a way for the institutions to try and control any possible changes that would be happening or any rebellions that would be happening. I think also a lot of individualizing of issues and making it seem as though it's specific to particular moments or to particular people. I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm suddenly blanking on all of the times that has happened to me. But basically, trying to seem as though it is something, whatever it is that someone is going through, something that's specific to that issue or specific to that person or whatever the case is. And as such, makes it much more difficult for that person and for people who might also want to fight against it to see it as a systemic issue. And if you don't see it as a systemic issue, then the institution doesn't have to do anything. So for example, I think, if you were to take, the issues with age, or Jodel is a great example, actually. The institution's stance on Jodel, which for those of you who don't know is the anonymous app that has a lot of racism and misogyny and transphobia and whatever on it. It's like the new version of Yik Yak. The institution's stances on it is basically just don't go on it. Just don't go on it. Just don't engage. Which is ridiculous because, first of all, the very nature of a college, if students hear that the institution doesn't want you to use it, they're going to use it more. And also, it doesn't address any of the core issues, which is that we don't have a way that students can engage in discourse. There aren't ways that students can easily make connections with people. And of course, that there is a lot of racism and misogyny and transphobia on campus. And Yodel is a way that students can express all of that hatred without facing any consequences. And part of that is because the institution does not see it as a systemic issue. They see it as individuals using this platform and they're causing the issues. And if people just stopped using the platform, then it wouldn't be an issue. Of course, completely ignoring that they just find another way to do it, right? Like we had Yik Yak and then finally they got rid of Yik Yak and now we have Yodel and there have been other examples like Hamilton Secrets, right? Like students will always find a way to be oppressive if that's what they want to be doing. In terms of what students can be doing to uphold and protect their own autonomy, I think one really big thing is trying to establish boundaries as soon as possible. So, I think of DMC organizations, right? Trying to establish boundaries with the institution as soon as possible, right? So like if you're the co-chair of BLSU, making it clear to the director of DMC or to your advisors or to the dean of students or whoever you might be in relations with that you are the co-chair of BLSU and ultimately you and the rest of the organization and the members are the ones who make the decisions about what happens with that organization. Within the understanding that, we don't have instances of organizations using their platforms to bring hatred as we do currently. Thinking about, so first making those boundaries very clear, because if you make those boundaries very clear, particularly in writing because of the way that the institution works, then when those boundaries are ultimately broken, you can go back and say, hey, I made explicitly clear to you what I wanted this relationship to look like, and you are disrespecting that relationship. You are disrespecting the boundaries that I have established. I think also, again, thinking about commitment, making sure that the people who are in your group or organization or whatever it is are very committed to those boundaries that you have established. So, for example, when I was president of Student Assembly, the cabinet and I had all decided that we were not going to allow the communications and marketing department to take images of us. And that was something that we all had to commit to. And so anytime any of us were approached by comms office to do anything, we were like, nope, we're not doing this. We have come to an agreement that this is a boundary, that we do not want to be tokenized. We do not want our work to be used by the institution as an example of transformation. We will not have our images taken. We don't want anything written about us, etc. That only worked because we had all committed to that boundary. And so there's also, again, like this level of commitment. And I think also just understanding that like the institution would not exist without you. It quite literally would not exist without you. Like as much as it tries to make it seem as though, oh, we're here because of the donors or whatever the case is, like if there were no students, Hamilton College would not exist. And so trying as much as you can to constantly remind yourself that you ultimately, you as in students, and in similar workers, like Bon Appetit staff, facilities management, faculty members, lower level staff members, like the institution would not exist without us, and we have all of the power. Not the board of trustees, not the president of the college, not the dean of students, we have the power. And that's something that we have to be consistently reminding ourselves of. And one of the faculty members who I interviewed talked about how she's always trying to, or how she knows that if students just recognized that they had that power and learned how to use that power in the most effective ways possible, that the institution would have no chance. And so I think that's something to also really consider.
I was just wondering what you thought about the historical role of activist organizations that were primarily white and problematic back in the day, such as the GSU and CIF, which do have still ongoing repercussions through that history, what role they played within these movements?
Yeah, so GSU, I'm not entirely sure what role they had. They weren't brought up too much throughout the histories. The Center for Intersectional Feminism, however, did have a pretty big role in SJI, especially in the start, because they were actually, they played a huge role in the protests against the keying of the cars, or of the car, and some other stuff that was happening with Greek life that was more along the lines of misogyny, and hatred against women and people who deal with misogyny. And so, I think, again, I don't really know too much about the history of GSU in specific relation to these organizations, but I do, or these movements and rebellions, but I do know that they have their own level of history. And I think that part of the issue is, again, thinking about lack of institutional knowledge and history. One of the reasons why I started off working, not working with, but being part of the Center for Intersectional Feminism, was because I learned about its very long history of activism organizing during Kirkland. And it was actually started by a Black woman, and it was predominantly a Black woman and woman of color space. And so in learning that history, I set out to try and reestablish that. I ended up not being able to do it because it was really exhausting and I didn't have resources and stuff like that. But if people could learn about these histories and start to understand the legacy of these organizations and start to understand their role in upholding those legacies of those organizations, I do think that we have a much better chance at solving some of these intracommunal and intercommunal issues that we see today that do make it much more difficult to establish those relationships and to establish really strong rebellions. So there were a lot of members of Women's Center who were part of SJI and who also just like generally helped SJI. I think also apparently Women's Center at the time was also very queer. So there was also that like other level of intersectional identity. And like I said, at that time, there had also been some like queer, anti-queer sentiments going on as well. And so there was that kind of like double dedication to liberation because they had like multi-marginalized identities. I'm going to take a question from the chat. Emily asks, we both know student government occupies a very unique and contradictory space in regards to marginalized students. SA is unable to be the student union your administration imagined because, oh, wait, is this? Wait. Oh, okay. What do you see as student government's role in rebellion, if not as instigators or vocal backers, then as allies, mediators, and space makers? So I think one thing that's really important to remember with regards to student governments in general is that these student government, or the idea of having a student government came in and of itself out of student rebellion. And student governments in colleges and in universities started to really be established in like the 50s. That came out of student rebellion. So I think very similar to, like I've already said with a bunch of other stuff, understanding the institutional history. I think everyone who enters student assembly should understand that student governments historically exist for the purpose of being advocates for students. And with student assembly, I think it's also really important to understand that the student assembly that was created is a combination of the student senate from Hamilton College and the Kirkland Assembly from Kirkland College. And something that was really important with Kirkland College is that everyone was part of the assembly. So Kirkland College's decision-making processes were actually entirely communal. And so students, faculty, staff, members of the board of trustees, they were all part, well, I don't know if members of the board of trustees were part of it, but they were all part of this Kirkland Assembly where they all made decisions about what would happen with the institution. And so when the two colleges merged, or when Hamilton took over Kirkland, we had the student assembly, and the first president of the student assembly was originally a Kirkland College student. So there's this specific history with student assembly at Hamilton that is also specifically in reference to and dedicated, or not dedicated, but with connection to Kirkland Assembly, which was a very radical, very different kind of assembly that prided itself on the fact that it really had all members of the institution, all stakeholders be part of the decision-making process. Students had an incredible amount of power in the Kirkland Assembly, and they attempted to uphold that power within student assembly when the two colleges merged. And I think that that's, again, a historical understanding that we need to understand, and I think members of student assembly need to understand that ultimately their responsibility is protecting and advocating for the student body. And with that also comes the responsibility of protecting and advocating the most marginalized students. And so I do think that actually student assembly has ideally a very big role in student rebellion and in student movements at Hamilton. But student assembly is probably one of the most co-opted spaces that I've ever been in. And both in terms of like the way that students on it have been co-opted and the way that like the structure of the assembly itself has been co-opted. And it is incredibly controlled or attempted, or the institution attempts to control it via the director of student activities, who's the advisor, and other members who are in relation to student assembly. So there's really a chokehold on student assembly that makes it incredibly difficult to actually protect students and advocate for students. Yeah, we'll take one more question and we'll do it from Sakarja, who asks, what were moments of joy you experienced and what was the toughest part? Moments of joy are definitely learning about those really sweet moments that alumni experienced. I loved hearing about SJI's experiences, their communal experiences. I kind of wanted to cry when that member started to want to cry. I think it was just it was incredibly inspirational to learn about the ways that it has been possible for Hamilton students to find deep community with each other. The toughest part, definitely, especially with the movement, having to delve into the very racist history of Hamilton. It wasn't at all, especially like having to go through, those Yik Yak posts and there's Hamilton secret posts. I mean, some truly like disgusting stuff. So that was really difficult, and I often had to take breaks away from that whenever I was working on those particular sections. I can ask that later. Yeah. We're like totally like way over time, so I'm gonna end it, but I'll be here, so if you have like additional questions, you can ask me. But thank you so much, everyone, especially for all of you who have stayed behind.